So today we're going to be meeting Manchester Cladiators to have a conversation and pledge our support in terms of the campaigns that they're fighting. They're fighting to remove flammable materials off of the outside of their buildings, be that cladding, be that insulation, be that ACM, which is what the cladding that was on Grenfell. We've just come off the back of Bolton Fire. We understand that there are a lot of people who are extremely worried about where they're living tonight. Since the fire in 2017, we've had 3 different Secretaries of State for housing, communities and local government, and we've had 4 housing ministers. Now, that to me is absolutely unacceptable. We are in a position where every time we have to tell the same story over and over and over again, and there is not a single person who's managed to remain in place long enough to actually be scrutinised in removing this cladding.
We arrived in Manchester on Wednesday and were astounded by the rate of development in the city centre, wondering at every turn whether these were all fire safe. An area hit hard by the crisis is the Green Quarter, where many blocks are at risk. It is estimated that Manchester has 79 high-risk blocks, with 15 covered in ACM, but these figures are likely to miss the scale of the crisis. Scarred by the idea that Grenfell was something that could happen again, our hypervigilance was unavoidable, comparing materials to those placed on the Cube in Bolton, Riverside in Barking, the Hamptons Estate in Worcester Park, and these are only to name a few. The cladding scandal is truly a national fire safety scandal that puts hundreds of thousands in vulnerable positions, not knowing if their homes or family members are safe. Multi-billion-pound corporations such as Arconic and Celotex, who provided the facade and insulation materials, as well as companies like Ryden, who project developed the trap at Grenfell, but it does not stop there. These companies are still allowed to continue selling their materials, identified by Sir Martin Morbick as non-compliant with building regulations. The evidence already available shows a level of incompetence that masks, like a shiny piece of aluminium cladding, the rotten core of the building industry. We went and spoke to Fran, Steve and Alex, some of the leading voices of the Manchester Cladiators.
Manchester Cladiators came about in about March this year, formed of residents across Greater Manchester who have fire safety issues. So some have ACM, some have high pressure laminate, some have timber cladding, some don't even really know what's wrong with their blocks. And we know from myself living here in the Green Quarter, we fought this pretty much on our own. So we thought it was really important to come together as a group.
Obviously living in a building that's deemed unsafe with an astronomical bill that we just simply cannot afford means there's a lot of stress, anxiety and depression amongst leaseholders.
Thank God, if the worst happened, how would it pan out? Would people get out of the building? Would the fire brigade be able to get here? Have they got trucks that can get high enough up the building to evacuate people? I don't believe Manchester can get higher than about 12 stories. So anybody where we are and above would be they can't get a platform up to get you out.
We have a stay put policy in my building. I'm going to be completely honest with you. Knowing what I know now, I live on the ground floor. I'd like to think I could get out fairly quickly. There's not a chance in hell that if my fire alarm goes off, I'm going to stay.
This is our updated evacuation plan. So it's just confirming that we still have a stay put policy, and this has been our policy ever since we first found out. However, if any residents have anything that would impact their ability to evacuate, let our management company know.
So our evacuation policy has always been stay put, so there's no communal fire alarm system. We've all got fire detectors in as apartment. The idea is that the apartments and the compartmentalisation would stop that spreading, but obviously you have concerns about if that's been done properly, if it would actually work in the event of a fire.
We're really struggling with government, so we've written to government several times. The previous government, we did actually get to go to Westminster and meet with them, but since Estimate Bay, Robert Jenrick, since they've come in, they've just not spoken to us. We know they had a task force set up, which I believe they're not having meetings anymore, but from a positive, Manchester Council have been fantastic for Manchester.
I just really hope that the government, I know obviously we're in an election and everybody's trying to get into power, but I just get the feeling that lip service gets paid to this and nobody actually does anything about it. And what we really need is for politicians to get a grasp of the situation and to deal with it, to force freeholders, to force managing agents to take action, to keep people informed, and to do the right thing and get these buildings sorted out.
Oh, I found out in a very peculiar way. So I kind of text the caretaker about 9 months after I'd bought it, just kind of, do you know anything about this, if we have the cladding? He said, unfortunately, we do. I then attended the AGM where we were told, it would cost £125,000 to remediate for the entire block, which was going to be covered by the sunk fund. After that, more testing and reports were carried out. The bill per leaseholder could be around the £30,000 mark.
Following on from Grenfell, the buildings were tested and we were told that we didn't have Grenfell style cladding. So we felt that we were kind of out of the woods in that respect. Once the new guidance came out, they've started doing tests now to find out if the fire breaks are correct and if the cladding's correct, and it's going to take up to 12 months, possibly more than 12 months to actually get those reports back. We won't know if the building's safe, if there's going to be a huge cost to put the building right with the cladding, and whilst we're waiting, we can't remortgage, nobody can sell a property.
I think it's absolutely horrendous that we're in this position, but we are one of the very, very lucky blocks that we're actually getting on our building. We've got ACM, high pressure laminate and dangerous insulation, and we are in such a privileged position that our work is happening now. However, we found out we had this dangerous issue on our building in July 2017, so to only be in the point that this is happening now is just, it's hard to find the words to talk about it, but we're just so glad to see that happening outside my window.
There doesn't seem to be a change coming. I can't see one, and I don't know if that's because the advisors who are advising the housing ministers are willing to kind of, put their knuckle line and make changes that are going to help and support us.
We know it's important to get it right, so if we just had our blocks done and it was just the ACM, our blocks would still be dangerous. So it is really important that every single block does get all of the dangerous material removed.
If it were not for Brexit, this would be front page news every single day. Politicians who ignore our calls and cries for help will not be remembered favourably should another Grenfell disaster happen again.
The Cladiators are not the only ones highlighting these issues though. Inside Housing and UK CAG, supported by Grenfell United, have been raising these issues nationwide under the hashtag #EndOurCladdingScandal. We were there for their first big meeting.
We are real residents that are delivering this content tonight. We're in a very similar situation as what you are, but I'm in a block now where our developer has put forward a fund to make sure that residents don't have to pay to make their home safe, and our work is now underway. But my role now is I'm going on to support all of you in the room today and to carry on campaigning to make sure that you're all in the same position. Kind of formalised it under the Manchester Cladiators brand, and that we do get a bit of chuckles with that, but we wanted something that was really media worthy, but it also demonstrates the fact that we're actually fighting to make our homes safe. This is something we shouldn't be having to do, but it's something that sadly we are having to do.
In terms of how we got here, I think if you start to kind of peel away the various different failures in different buildings, you build up a picture of what I think you can only really describe as a total failure. There's responsibility in the construction sector, which has been cutting corners and chasing profits, and that cuts across residential, commercial, social housing, private housing. Almost anything that's been built over the last 15 years does not seem to be up to the standard it should have been. But part of why this situation is so difficult is because so many people are to blame. Every party points the finger at someone else. So when you try and hold a construction company to account, they point to the product manufacturer. And when you try and hold a product manufacturer to account, they point to building control. And when you try and hold building control to account, they point to the government. And so that means that within that circle, no one will act because they think that the next person along the chain is the one who's actually really supposed to be doing it. We at Inside Housing and the Cladiators in the UK have kind of come to the conclusion that the only real way through this is to push government to act.
I'm Tiago Alves. I used to live in Grenfell Tower. Now, the point that we're trying to make as Grenfell United, as both Peruvian survivors of Grenfell Tower, is that we need to make sure that people are safe in their home. That's why we partnered up with Pete, the Manchester Cladiators, as well as UK CAG. Thousands of people go to bed in this country not knowing whether or not their building will go up in flames. Now, I've had the opportunity to go around Manchester today, me and a couple of other people from Grenfell United, to look around to see whether the level of remediation here in Manchester. We've taken a look at some of the buildings that we know are cladded in combustible materials. If we do not go after government, if we do not start lobbying and saying something needs to change, nothing will ever change.
I want to say thank you basically to all of the people that came up here and did some talk for us today. I know some of you have dropped in very last minute, I do apologise. So I really appreciate you coming up and spending the time and delivering these talks.
After the meeting, we spoke with Peter Apps, one of the leading journalists campaigning for residents to be safe in their homes. Given the issues we are facing, Pete has found inspiration in the remediation programme in Victoria State in Australia, where a task force has been set up. I will let Pete explain more.
I mean, it's a scandal because for 30 years, various organisations have failed in the way that they've built buildings. That includes the construction sector, it includes the government and the way it's regulated the construction sector and the regulations it's written. It includes the people that have signed off buildings, it includes the companies that have manufactured the products and sold them and the companies that have tested and certified those products. That whole failure has resulted in many buildings which people sleep in every night not being safe. Grenfell was just one example of that, and as the months and years from Grenfell have passed, we've learned how many more there are, and the only conclusion can be that there's been a systemic failure in making those buildings safe. And I think that's a scandal in itself, but what makes it an even bigger scandal is that now, as it stands, the people who are going to pick up the bill and pay the price for that failure are the people who live in those buildings and not the people who are to blame for it. When you start to understand the scale of this problem and how many buildings there are that have something wrong with them. I mean, there's estimates that it could be half of all medium and high-rise buildings in the UK. We need to forget the idea that this is going to be solved next year. It isn't. What we need to do is make sure that there isn't another Grenfell, and in the time it takes to make these buildings safe, that if there is a fire, nobody dies. So that means first understanding which are the buildings with the biggest risk and making sure that the work goes to them first, because at the moment it's just market forces which are determining which building is remediated in which order. If it's done in a rush and if it's done under the same sort of budget constraints which the buildings were originally built under and which the Grenfell refurbishment was done under, it's going to be done badly. There needs to be external control and external checking. And second, it means taking a really proactive approach to evacuation plans, interim measures, sprinklers, fire alarms, all of those sort of things in these buildings that we know are at risk, to make sure that in the time between now and the combustible materials coming off the walls, if there is a fire, at least everyone has a chance to get out. And fundamentally, money to make sure that we don't just create the same problems again in 5 or 10 years' time. But if we said the exterior of all buildings must be non-combustible and all buildings above 2 or 3 stories need to have sprinklers, we wouldn't be having Grenfell, we wouldn't be building buildings that would burn in that way.
We hope you can see, like us, this is a scandal of gargantuan proportions that threatens life across our country. Government must act now to end this scandal and guard the right to life.